Well, hello there. My name is Lenny Hernandez, and I'm the host of Arrow's Diversity and Inclusion Speaker Series. The purpose of this series is to provide information, insight, and empathy into experiences, walks of life, and causes that many of us may not have previously had the opportunity to learn about. Our job here at Arrow is to build community, and ensuring that everyone feels understood and welcomed is one of the most important aspects of that job. And we believe that doesn't just stop at our front doors. Today, I'd like to introduce to you Aran MacKinnon, author and professor of history at the University of West Georgia. He sat down with Gwen Moore, a resident at Kingsland Walk Senior Living, for a discussion all about Nelson Mandela. They talked about the history of apartheid in South Africa, the efforts of Nelson Mandela to end apartheid, Nelson Mandela's legacy, his tenure as president, and so much more. Please enjoy.
I think his work is one of the great success stories of Africa and the world, and I think anybody would be well served by looking at his story.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and for you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. My name's Aran MacKinnon. I'm currently the chair and a professor of history at Georgia College and State University, which is more or less right in the center of the state of Georgia here in Milledgeville. I've been a student of African history in general and South African history for an awfully long time. I actually grew up in parts of Africa based on my parents' work back in the 1960s, and I had an opportunity to live in and school in Nigeria and Uganda when I was young. Grew up in Canada, and then had a fascination with South African history after my undergraduate experience. Had an opportunity to travel to South Africa in the mid-1980s. And in fact, on my first trip to South Africa, I remember my father driving me past what was known as Pollsmoor Prison, just outside of Cape Town at the time. And he pointed up and he said, "In there is Nelson Mandela, who is the leader of the sort of freedom struggle in South Africa, but he's currently a political prisoner, and he's banned and cannot be quoted or discussed in public." And that really captured my imagination. And I've sort of followed the story ever since, even though my work on South African history is kind of focused on a range of different things. But it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with Gwen today about Mandela's story.
Wow, that's fantastic. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'm Gwen Moore. I live here in Kingsland Walk in St. Louis, Missouri. But I retired from teaching at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. I taught business. I taught the last class they needed to graduate with a degree in business. So I had them, and it was a lot of fun. But before that, I was a commercial banker. I was a chief financial officer of the American Red Cross when AIDS hit. I did a lot of stuff. Had my own mortgage company. And before I was teaching, I was the vice chancellor of administration and deputy to the chancellor at that university. But aside from all that, I'm looking forward greatly to discussing Nelson Mandela. The last place I went in Africa was Ghana. But none of that. I'm really just looking forward to. Tell me, what is apartheid and how did it start in South Africa? How did it get started?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. I mean, it's a great way to enter into it because I think it helps us understand, Mandela and his struggle and the whole effort politically that he was behind. So, apartheid, as we think of it, is actually a formal articulation of a set of policies that came out under a government in South Africa in 1948. And it was a particular concept that they had developed. It's actually an Afrikaner word. So the Afrikaners were people of Dutch descent, defined themselves as white, and embraced what we think of as kind of imperial notions of whiteness and superiority and supremacy. And they began to develop that in the context of South Africa over a number of centuries, beginning in the 1650s. By the time we get to 1948, that cultural bloc, that group of people, had come to dominate white minority segregationist politics in South Africa. It was a white minority rule government at that point in
So
time.
you're saying the whites were a minority, they weren't the majority in South Africa?
Correct. And that's one of the interesting differences between, we can talk more about this, but between South Africa and the American context is that the Black population of South Africa, broadly constructed, which includes a range of different ethnicities, is the vast majority. I mean, over 80% of the population. So for the longest period of time, whites were a tiny minority, but because of the structures of, white supremacy, the advantages they had militarily, their political lockhold on the use of violence and state oppression, they managed to control the political system. So in 1948, the Afrikaners developed this concept called apartheid, which literally just means separateness or separate development or being apart. But the real background to apartheid actually is long in the making. It goes all the way back, even earlier. Some argue that the idea of separating races in South Africa really began early on with the establishment of the Dutch under the what was called the Dutch East India Company. So in 1652, they set themselves up in Cape Town and they established a foothold there to support their broader empire, actually out as far as Indonesia. And then because of religious and cultural and linguistic differences, they sort of set themselves up and against the indigenous peoples. The people that lived closely to them in that area were called the Khoisan, an indigenous set of groups, polities, ethnicities in the Cape region. And because of cultural, religious, and racial concepts of difference, the Dutch set up these separate communities. And in fact, I was just in Cape Town 3 weeks ago, and I was in a place called Kirstenbosch Gardens, which is a beautiful botanic gardens right at the base of Table Mountain, which is the site of where the Cape Town was established. And there they claim they still have the plantings of a bitter almond. It's a type of plant which has a lot of thorny, bushy kind of growth, a bitter almond hedge that Jan van Riebeck, the established, the person who established the Dutch East India Company in South Africa, that he had planted to separate the white Dutch settlers from the African people. So that was the beginning, arguably, of this idea of creating two cultures, two communities, two separate areas, even though there was a lot of interplay.
Here we had separate but equal. Was that?
Absolutely not. So, the idea of separate but equal, I mean, arguably, I think by the time you get to apartheid, the white South African government would have said, we're not talking about equality. We're talking about their euphemism was respect for African culture. And they argued that Africans only wanted to be traditional and tribal and rural and to live in a way that was sort of grounded in a kind of primordial history. And of course, we know that, some Africans would have embraced a rural pastoral lifestyle, but others, like, as we'll discover, Nelson Mandela, very modern, very educated, very attuned with so-called Western political and educational values, and embrace that. So the idea that you could prevent Africans from opportunities to develop and be educated and to participate fully in the economy is understood as a crime. And the United Nations designated that as a crime.
Okay. You mentioned Nelson, we're starting on Nelson Mandela. How did he come to be?
So, he was born into a context, and just by way of a bit of background, I was going to mention that the idea of that separation that had long been established, one of the things that really drove the reason why white minority rule sought to oppress and hold Africans down was they wanted cheap African labor to support the mining industry in South Africa, gold mining and diamond mining. And if we have a chance, we can talk more about that, the role of Cecil Rhodes and migrant labor, and how the big mining industries in the central parts of South Africa pulled in highly exploited, underpaid African labor to work as migrants in these mining industries with terrible peril and risk of life. And that was the context that Mandela grew up in. So in 1918, Mandela's born in a very rural area, an area called Transkei. Mandela was part of a larger cultural group known as the Xhosa. And I can talk a little bit more about, sometimes if you listen to Southern African speakers of indigenous languages, you'll hear what are called those click sounds. Very famously, Miriam Makeba, who was a celebrated South African singer in the US, she did a quite a well-known song called the Click Song. And she sort of helped Americans sort of listen to that idea of the various click sounds. So for example, Mandela's background, the kingdom that he was born into is part of what's called the Xhosa people, and that's Xhosa, and the X is a sound. So his rural group, the Xhosa chiefdoms, were on the eastern coast of South Africa, between the area of Cape Town and the northern reaches of what was called Natal province, or the area where the Zulu kingdom was. Many people may have heard of the Zulu kingdom.
Well, so he grew up in a rural area. How did he become educated?
Yeah, great question. So interestingly enough, his father was actually a chief and was a member of what was then known as the Tembu royal family. And the Tembu were a subset of the Xhosa chiefdoms. And his father was a sort of what we would call a counselor to the kings of the Tembu people. So his father, who had a Christian name, Henry Gadla Mandela, worked in what was then understood as a colonial context. So by this point in time, by the early 20th century, every African state, sovereign kingdom, group of people had been conquered by both the British, who arrived in South Africa after the Dutch, and the South African state. So all through the 18th and into the 19th century, there had been these successive wars against African people to break down their sovereignty and to compel those people to go and work in the mines and to work in white economic activities. So Mandela's born into that context. His father is a counselor, and we can go into the details later maybe, but his father was caught up by colonial politics. And every African chief who worked in the system of what we would call indirect rule, they were compelled to work for a colonial administrator. In this case, it was a British magistrate who had political authority over the region. And then African leaders, if they wanted to stay in place, they had to work with that colonial administration. Mandela's father ran afoul of that. He challenged the authority of this magistrate, and he was removed from his position as chief. It was over a land dispute. But when that happened, Mandela's family was kind of in free fall. His father lost his job and his income. He lost some of his prestige because he could no longer operate as a chief. And Mandela's sort of struggles then began at that point. Sometime later, about 5-6 years later, his father actually died from tuberculosis, which was not uncommon in the rural areas of South Africa because, in fact, it was something that migrant workers brought back with them from having been in the mining areas. So his father dies of tuberculosis. And at that point, Mandela's mother, who was a Christian, had to move the family. And she did have some support, so she was able to introduce Nelson. At that point, he wasn't known as Nelson. His original personal name was Roli Hlahla. And Roli Hlahla was a name his father given him. And in Xhosa, that name means the person who shakes the branches, shakes the tree. And it basically means like a disruptor, an agitator. So it was kind of an appropriate name for him. So Roli Hlahla goes off to a mission school. By this point in time, Africans had been Christianized in many areas, and mission Christian education was fairly widespread in the rural areas where he lived. So because his family had a little bit of support, they could send him to a Christian mission school. And that's where the school teacher says, well, Roli Hlahla, I don't know that I like that name. You need a good Christian name. You're going to be called Nelson. So that's where he begins his Western education. And from that point on, his education is kind of parallel. He has a Western education in colonial system schools and colleges, but he also embraces his African heritage and his African education that he gets as he grows up and becomes a man through ceremonies associated with his Tembu family.
Okay. What did Nelson Mandela do to end apartheid? How did he do it? I mean, that's a big job.
Yeah, it was
complicated.
It was absolutely. And, he was deeply committed to this idea that he saw the unfairness of the colonial system as it had developed over time. And as a young man, he went to college and he became a kind of a political agitator. So that was kind of what was in his blood. He actually got expelled from college when he first went there. In the rural area at a place, a university called Fort Hare, which was a mission college for African students. So he always was politically minded. But then he wanted to escape the rural life. He wanted to see the bright lights in the big city. So he left the rural areas and he went to the city of Johannesburg, which was the main mining city. It's the largest city in South Africa. It was the place where young guys could go and really, grow up. So he kind of snuck away from his rural life and went to the city of Johannesburg. But because of his royal background and roots, he had some connections and he was able to get some jobs there. And he eventually gets a job. He was interested in law, but he gets a job working for a law firm. And that law firm actually helped a lot of Africans try and get housing in the urban areas. Because, of course, with segregation and apartheid, Black people were not allowed permanent residence in the white cities. So that was his first foray into addressing the injustices of South Africa. But you may have heard of the African National Congress, which is the political party that he joined. And in that period of time, this was in the late 1940s, the African National Congress was really developing. It had been an established, go ahead.
Was that the ANC?
Correct.
Talked about, okay.
Yeah. So the ANC had long roots. And in fact, it was initially started in 1912 by elite Africans, Christian Western educated Africans who wanted the vote. And they were denied the vote. And they said, well, wait a second. The British, who actually had taken over South Africa, had always said that if you were educated and had land and property, you should have a right to vote. But over time, they prevented that opportunity. So the African National Congress, or the ANC as we know it, developed to represent African interests. So you wind forward the late 1940s, Mandela arrives in Johannesburg and he says, these are the guys I want to work with. They're the ones who are supporting African interests, and they want everybody to have the vote. They want a democratic South Africa, and I want to support that. So he joined the ANC. at that point in time.
Super. what other things did he concentrate on? What did he think would end apartheid?
Yeah, as you pointed out, it's a complex question. So when he began, the ANC had a policy of nonviolence, and this is a really important thing for thinking about Mandela because he was committed to nonviolence. And then in 1952, the ANC began a program of action called the Defiance Campaign. They said, we're fed up with apartheid, we're fed up with segregation, we're fed up with restrictions and racist laws, and we're going to protest this. And the South African government responded to that with violence. So there was a very brutal response to the Defiance Campaign. And people may be familiar with a little bit after this had developed, there was an episode referred to as the Sharpeville Massacre. And what happened was protesters against the government were shot by the police. Innocent political protesters without arms. And at that point in time, Mandela and the ANC said, they have changed the terms of the struggle. We didn't begin with violence. We began with peaceful protest, with lobbying, with petitions, with asking for opportunity, and they responded with violence. So Mandela and others reluctantly said, now we must respond with violence. And they developed what we call an armed wing. It was part of the ANC structure, but it was known as Mkhonto Wisizwe, which translates as the spear of the nation. So you think about traditional African warriors and the use of spears, it was hearkening back to that heritage. So Mandela becomes the first leader of this organization, which says, hey, we didn't start this, but we now believe the only way to compel the government to listen to our demands is if we use strategic violence. And Mkhonto Wisizwe then began a campaign of what some might argue are terrorist tactics. They didn't direct things initially at people, but at government installations like post offices, military and police establishments. And that was the beginning of Mandela's sort of more radical approach to the politics of the day, was his work with Mkhonto Wisizwe.
Did that relate to how he wound up in prison? How did he get there? What happened?
So, you know, and you can imagine he's a young guy at this point, and I think he might even acknowledge, you know, I've listened to some tapes recently, some interviews that were done by the man, he was actually the former editor of Time magazine, Richard Stengel, who kind of helped Mandela write his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. And this guy Stengel has recovered these tapes that he did in these interviews with Mandela, asking him about his life to help with the autobiography. And he kind of gets Mandela to agree or to acknowledge that, yeah, when he was young, he was a bit of a hothead. So one of the things he did in 1962 is Mandela went on a trip. The ANC sent him throughout Africa. So he escaped from South Africa. He was actually a wanted man at that point. The government had identified him as persona non grata, somebody who could be arrested for political agitation. So he left the country. He went up through Botswana. He went all the way through East Africa, Ethiopia, Sudan. He went to Algeria and Morocco. He actually went to Ghana and stopped off in some places in West Africa as well. And the purpose of that trip was to get money and to be trained in guerrilla tactics so that they could, you know. And later on in that year, he returned to South Africa and he got picked up. And here's a kind of curious story. The intelligence branch of the South African police were the ones who located him. And he was actually, the trick he used was, because he was a black man, the cover he wanted to use was actually, he created this pseudonym. His other name was David Motsumai. And David Motsumai, his pseudonym, his other persona, he was actually supposed to be a chauffeur for a white guy.
Okay.
And so he and this white man, a guy named Cecil Williams, who was he was a supporter of the ANC, and was very supportive of the the African cause. They used to drive around and make it appear as if Mandela was driving this white guy around as his chauffeur, but that was their cover. At any rate, what we now know is that it was actually an American CIA operative working in Durban in South Africa
Okay.
who got a message that Mandela was coming back and was going to an ANC meeting in Durban. And they tracked him to that meeting. And that's when the special branch, the police, tracked him down and he got arrested. So at that point in time, he was put in jail for 5 years for agitation and for having left the country illegally. While he's in jail, the South African security forces discovered a secret hideout that the ANC and the South African communists had put together. And this was the place where all of their secret documents for espionage, for the guerrilla tactics, for using explosives and all that stuff was discovered. And it linked back to Nelson Mandela. His name was on some of the documents. And that's what led him to the espionage, the final trial.
Amazing. So what happened in the trial?
Well, it was very fateful. And in fact, in the moment, everybody was pretty certain that the state was going to bring the death sentence, because these people that were, among them Nelson Mandela, that had been charged, had been found to be associated with sabotage, with espionage, with using violence against the state. And that was all treasonous. And that would have led to the possibility of a death sentence. And then very famously at the trial, Mandela makes this very moving speech. And the speech had actually been helped in writing the speech by a great South African writer, a woman named Nadine Gordimer. And so she helps him write the speech, and he decides that he's not going to go for mercy. He's not going to go for trying to convince them that he has a defense. He's going to use this as a political opportunity to get the message out, to put the state on trial, essentially, to try and show that it was the South African government that was guilty of crimes and that they had only responded to these. And this is where he says famously, "I have fought all my life against white domination. I have fought all my life against Black domination. I do hope to live for a democratic and united South Africa. And this is something I hope to live for. But if needs be, my Lord, this is something for which I am prepared to die." And it's one of the most chilling political speeches I've ever heard, and the most moving statement. Luckily, fortuitously, the judge says life imprisonment as opposed to the death sentence. And that's the moment in which Mandela disappears from everything for the next 27 years.
Yeah. Okay.
So do you remember that time, Gwen? Do you remember hearing about Mandela during his long incarceration?
Right. Yes, I do. In jail, but I heard that it was more like a college, that the people in jail got to talk to each other and come up with ways to victory.
Yeah, excellent point. So Mandela was absolutely committed. He had been educated. He did work towards a BA degree through a correspondence university. And then later he did take a law degree. So he was a very skilled politician and lawyer. But you're absolutely right. While they were on Robben Island together, which was this island just off of Cape Town, which was this prison, high security, it's kind of like South Africa's Alcatraz. I mean, there's no escape. You can see the land and the city, but you can't make it there because of the terrible currents and water and cold and so on. But all of these fellow ANC members who were imprisoned with him at the time, I mean, I think arguably the government may have made their fatal mistake because they allowed them to be together.
Yes.
Had you heard about all of that?
Yes. called it Mandela University or something like that.
Yeah, Robben Island. And so what they did was each one of them, while they were together, they would have time, and each one of them took responsibility for teaching others. And then any other political prisoners that came in, they taught them all about communist philosophy and Marxism in terms of how to think about creating a new state that was more equitable and would distribute wealth, about political strategy, about the history of African people. So they also wanted to draw on their heritage, telling stories about the great leaders of African society, from Zulu society and Xhosa society as well. And that was vital for them.
Did any of this lead to apartheid, ending apartheid? How did that happen with Nelson Mandela in jail? And how did they manage to make that happen?
So it was a big challenge. Of course, all of the correspondence going in and out of, Robben Island was very highly moderated and censored. But nevertheless, they were able to secrete messages out. And of course, not all of the members of the African National Congress ended up in prison on Robben Island. Many of the leaders also, in addition to Mandela, people like Oliver Tambo, managed to escape South Africa, and they kept the African National Congress going in exile. So Tambo lived in the UK, in London, and they kept the network going. And they helped to bring international recognition to the crime of apartheid. And that pressure helped. So there was external pressure, but the real pressure came from all of the young people. So while Mandela was in jail, his wife at that time, it was his second wife, he had divorced his first wife, Evelyn Massey, when he was quite young. They were very different people. They had been married when they were young. And Mandela, as he became more and more involved in the political struggle, was not prepared to devote his life to being a family man. Yes. So he married Winnie Mandela, and she helped to keep the struggle going as well. She kept an international spotlight on the struggle and on her husband. And all through those 27 years, she helped to be in communication. She was one of the few people who could visit him and get information out and help keep a spotlight on it.
So how did that spotlight become ending apartheid?
So the combination of international pressure, which included disinvesting from South Africa, people and companies taking money away from the South African government and the economy, helped to bring a lot of if we think about what we see now with Ukraine, trying to politically and economically isolate Russia. So a lot of people beginning more expressly in the 1980s helped to isolate South Africa. Then the other thing is there was a grassroots movement in South Africa called the Mass Democratic Movement. And this was virtually everybody, all the African people, with the exception of a few who worked within the government. Most of them in South Africa were in constant efforts at boycotting stores, at going on strikes, on helping to show the problems of apartheid and to continue with the pressure. And eventually that led to a political change and an opening up and a decision to move to a transition to give Africans greater political opportunity. And that was with a more sort of slightly more liberal-minded white minority president, a man named F.W. de Klerk.
Yes. He played a good role in ending apartheid, de Klerk did. How did de Klerk and Mandela get together?
Well, it's interesting, de Klerk just passed away last year, and just before he died, he gave this very moving speech. It was for a couple of minutes, literally just days before he died, in which he finally apologized for apartheid, which was, I think, very useful and helpful. But he and Nelson Mandela, even though they had to work very closely, Mandela did not really respect de Klerk, because I think he believed de Klerk was not very truthful. And all the way to the end, de Klerk realized that the tide had changed and that change was coming, but he was very reluctant, and he wanted to safeguard minority interests for whites in South Africa. And in fact, he was prepared, in order to ensure that, to use what we would call a dirty tricks campaign. He allowed the South African police to support opponents of the ANC in stirring up what could have become a civil war. And it was very ugly and very violent when members of a smaller group of Black separatists known as the Inkatha Freedom Party, which were Zulu-based, they wanted to break away. They wanted to have their own kind of separate state. And they thought if they worked with the white government, they could achieve that and retain political power. And Mandela and the ANC said, absolutely not. We want a unitary state. We want full democracy. We do not want to break this country up. And de Klerk allowed the behind the scenes violence to stir things up in order to hopefully allow it to break apart. And Mandela was very frustrated with that and very angry at de Klerk for being dishonest about it. So even though they did share in the Nobel Peace Prize for having brought South Africa out of apartheid, Mandela, I think, never fully forgave de Klerk for his efforts to try and retain white opportunity in the new South Africa.
Yeah, amazing. What did he do? What did Nelson Mandela do when he was finally released from prison? What
Wow.
happened?
You know, my heart goes out to him, because you can imagine, here's a man who suffered for 27 years in prison.
Amazing. Yeah.
It's just, you know, it makes you want to weep. And yet he comes out with optimism, with strength, and with incredible courage to lead the country to a peaceful outcome.
Yeah.
So he very quickly, he realizes that they have the groundswell, they have the upper hand, the ANC has the majority of the political support necessary to win democratic elections. So very, very shrewdly, he realized that in order to get to that point where they can win that election in 1994, he actually does need to do something to assure whites that they will not be driven from the country, that their homes will not be burned, that they won't be the targets of political violence, that they can still be there in South Africa, they can still have a good life, and they can still contribute. And that was tough, because a lot of whites were, you know, very nervous, very suspicious. Many had never lived equally with Black people and couldn't see themselves in an open, democratic, non-racial society. So Mandela did a lot of kind of social activities to try and pull whites in. And among them was, he said, well, I know these whites, they love their sports. They love their rugby. Rugby is a big support for South African whites. Let's support that. Let's give them this opportunity. Let's tell them there is a dividend. If you walk with me to freedom, if you join me in a democratic South Africa, life will still be good for you. And he actually managed to do that. They actually hosted the World Cup for rugby when he was newly elected as a president, to try and soothe the tensions among the whites and reassure them that it was going to be okay. But he had a lot of struggles. And I think there are many people who would say that even now, while there has been this wonderful political revolution in South Africa, we have democracy, we have, you know, one person, one vote. It's still a very unequal country. The wealth is not very well distributed. You do have a large, now growing group of Black elites who have a lot of money, but whites still retain a lot of the resources, capital, corporate power. And unfortunately, there's also been some terrible problems with corruption. And so some members of the African National Congress have taken opportunity to sort of pull money out of government opportunities that they really shouldn't. And it's kind of hindering the country. And a lot of people are saying, where's Nelson Mandela now? You know, this is the time we need that leader. I mean, he took us to freedom, but now we need him, you know, and sadly, as we know, he passed away in 2013. So it's a tough struggle now to deal with those questions.
Yeah.
Gwen, I was going to ask you, a little bit about, because I grew up outside of America, and my mother was American, and she actually remembers back in the 1950s, when she was a college student, boycotting South African oranges. She said, "I'm not going," and so she was. I was just wondering, what is your sense of how people in America viewed the anti-apartheid movement? What memories do you have of that?
I still remember boycotting businesses that helped South Africa, that purchased things from there or bought businesses there. Anybody that kind of helped white South Africa, we learned about and we could boycott it, and we heard them. They would feel it. The stock market began to know who had strayed, and it wasn't good for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was part of this global effort that Mandela and the ANC supported, right? The global anti-apartheid movement, which really raised consciousness, and I think was vital and supported that. Of course, the other thing I love about what people in America know a little bit about of South Africa is the music. I don't know if do you have any favorites of South African musicians? We talked a little bit about Miriam Makeba.
Yeah. That's about it.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
It's interesting. She came to light more recently because she was a real critic of the apartheid system. And when she came to the US, this would have been in the 50s, and she was with her then husband, a guy named Hugh Masekela, although later on she had relations with other people in the US music industry. But she actually went and spoke before the United Nations and was given an opportunity to condemn apartheid in the 50s. And you know who the person was who discovered her and helped her grow as an artist in the US was Harry Belafonte, who just passed away. And it gave me a newfound kind of appreciation for the great activism that Harry Belafonte supported all his career, the people that he.
Yeah. Don't get me started. Okay.
Sure. Well, I was going to mention that a contrast to, I think, civic-minded, democratic-minded, progressive Americans who were very aware of apartheid and cared and wanted to see change and helped to pressure for change. There was a bit of a contrast with the US government because their track record was not perhaps as progressive, right?
Yeah, right. And that's how, do you have a feeling or a memory of how it differed from separate but equal here in the US?
Yeah, partly the big difference, which is not an excuse, it doesn't make anything right, but one of the biggest challenges is that in South Africa the demographics are different, right? So there's such a large African population and a small minority white population that it makes the situation even more glaring, I think. But I think that the two stories were in dialogue for a long period of time. It's interesting, some of, from the earliest time in the 19th century, Black gospel singers from the US actually traveled to South Africa to give performances. And South Africans always thought of Black Americans as being like so modern and so powerful. In fact, during the Second World War, there were rumors that used to run through the rural areas of South Africa that when they heard about Blacks joining the US Armed Forces, they had these millenarian myths where they thought, some of them kind of like in a hopeful, revolutionary ideal, they hoped that Black American paratroopers were going to land in rural South Africa and help to liberate them. And that was part of this kind of, I think, race solidarity that was across the Atlantic. And musical exchanges, cultural exchanges, even dress. If you look at young Nelson Mandela when he goes to Johannesburg, he's dressed in these really dapper 1940s clothes that Americans, and he used to love the Western movies, the cowboys and Indians. Of course, white South Africans who showed those movies could never understand why it was that the Black South Africans were always rooting for Indians against the white settlers. But there's a lot of kind of cultural exchange. And I think the solidarity that a lot of Americans provided to South Africans isn't always as well known. Yeah. But it's a big part of their culture. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, they really admired Black American culture, music, dress, and politics. And they were inspired by those things there as well.
Interesting. How did Nelson Mandela become the president? How the politics of that?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting kind of story. Mandela, when he was in prison, took some decisions that some people in the political party, the ANC, kind of criticized. He started these conversations with the white government while he was in prison to try and kickstart negotiations to help move things ahead. The white South African government had offered him amnesty. They said, we'll let you out of prison if you renounce violence, if you accept that you're coming into South Africa and you're going to end violent opposition. And he refused. He said, I'm not providing any changes. There's no conditional release here. Until you recognize our political party, until you stop using violence, we're not going to give up the struggle. But he did realize that the time had come, this was in the late 1980s, where there was momentum for change. He could tell there was opportunity, that white businesses in South Africa were frustrated by the downturn in the economy because of sanctions. So he began these conversations with the South African government. And some people in the ANC said, you shouldn't do that. You don't have our authority. Only the president, who was Oliver Tambo in exile, can do this. So Mandela kind of took a risk, and he began those conversations, which eventually led to the negotiations and his freedom. But he did get castigated. I mean, he got in trouble. He got hauled up by the ANC leadership, and they said, what are you doing having these discussions with the government without telling us? And it's funny, because as you may know, the ANC actually modeled itself on a kind of like Soviet-style communist single-party model. It's a very centralized party, a very structured, organized, sort of socialist ideal politically. So when he was released and he was questioned, all he said he did was he looked at them and he shook his head and he said, I remain a loyal and disciplined member of the ANC. I remain a loyal and disciplined member of the ANC. He didn't want to reveal that he had maybe taken some risks. Nevertheless, the next steps that came after his release was a very long period from 1990 all the way through 1993 with negotiations over what the new South Africa was going to look like. How was the government going to be structured? And even though they knew the ultimate goal was a unitary, full democracy, Mandela knew that he didn't want a civil war. So he did have to give opportunities to provide whites and this other group, the Zulu Inkatha Freedom Party. He had to guarantee that they had some role to play in the new government because he knew the ANC was going to win. So they created a transitional government, what they called the Government of National Unity. And it was to operate for a fixed period of time. And they had a sunset clause in it to allow whites and the Inkatha Freedom Party to maintain some political power. And that's what led to this miraculous democratic election in 94. And by that point, he was the leader of the ANC. And as leader of the ANC, he became the president in the new South Africa.
Super, super. Please tell me about Nelson Mandela's legacy.
You know, as a historian going into this, when I was a young man and studying South Africa, it was pretty dark and dismal. And I remember being taught by professors who were part of the struggle politically and had fought for a liberated South Africa. And it was exciting and invigorating, but it was without optimism. And I think the greatest legacy that Mandela provides is in my lifetime, in his lifetime, he was successful at fostering a democratic, non-racial South Africa. And that's the biggest legacy. And having just returned from South Africa recently, I can say, yes, there are some real challenges in that country, but democracy is there. It's non-racial. It is an African country that has a very non-racial, cosmopolitan feel. And I think that's the most exciting legacy. It's a beautiful country with beautiful people, with incredible historical heritage. And that's all there and open and accessible because of his work. His legacy is even greater than that. I think there's so many important lessons we can learn about political leadership, about negotiation and compromise, about the pragmatism over the debate between nonviolence and using revolutionary pressure when necessary. Those are incredible stories. And I think anybody who is a student of political history would be well served by looking at his story. I think the other thing is, I mean, the man had style. You know, beyond everything else, Madiba, that was his clan name. He was affectionately known by personal friends as Madiba. He was cool into his 70s and 80s. He dressed sharp. He had cool shirts that he had commissioned. He loved to be with people. He embraced his family. He had a large family based on children and grandchildren from 3 marriages. Probably the thing that made me smile the most was that after 2 very troubled marriages through a very troubled political life, he finally ends up with happiness by marrying Graça Machel, his last wife, before he, the wife he had as he passed away. And I think he did finally get a time of happiness when he was no longer president. He no longer had the burden of the nation, and he could enjoy himself for even a few years. And I think that was an important part of the legacy.
Terrific, terrific. One thing he said, it always seems impossible until it's done. You never know.
Absolutely. And I think that's a wonderful way to close the discussion, because his perseverance, his belief in the dignity of humanity and people, his commitment to that saw him through a long and troubled life, and yet it was a good outcome. I mean, there's work still to be done. There always will be. But I think his work is one of the great success stories of Africa and the world in terms of political transformation. That nicely captures it.
Super. Thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and your experience in South Africa, in Africa.
Well, thank you, Gwen. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and to talk with you. And I look forward maybe to more conversations if I can get to St. Louis.
Okay. Can I just say Baraka Bashad, which means may the blessings be?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I will respond with a wonderful South African phrase, Hambakashli, which is the Zulu phrase which means go safely, go well, be safe and well.
Bye.
And I think to myself, what a